Kafka Hibino is an ugly, pathetic loser who has no real ambitions and failed promises. Little does he know his life is about to take a huge turn for the worst. The story starts with the boring-looking city being under surveillance and is reported to have nothing unusual happening. Suddenly, a monster called Kaiju swims through the water, starts to attack the city. It sounds off the Kaiju emergency alarms. Citizens immediately start to seek shelter, and others even taking guesses as to which division is going to save the day. Turns out it is the 3rd Division to come to their rescue. As the Kaiju starts going on a Godzilla rampage, destroying everything in its path, the generic version of the Power Rangers from the 3rd Division shows up with a mysterious baddie gracefully jumping out of the aircraft. The rest of her groupies then start to move in. They get into formation and start uselessly shooting the monster. The helicopter then decides to shoot missiles at the Kaiju, which ends up just scratching its back. As the defense force start to close in, they subdue the Kaiju, and our mysterious hottie has had enough of her team's failure and blasts the Kaiju with a bazooka, obliterating it to pieces. It then starts pouring red rain. It then shows our main character, Kafka Hibino, an old, pathetic, ugly loser who has never achieved anything in his life. Stuck as a garbage man, his only job is to dispose and clean up dead Kaiju. Little does he know, his life is about to take a huge turn. Kafka and his co-workers spy from a distance, just like I did after my ex dumped me, and state that it's going to be a long day trying to dispose of the remains and clean up the city. After the Kaiju massacre is complete, the city celebrates the 3rd Division, while our worthless Kafka pathetically stands behind everyone while he waits to clean the aftermath. Finally, Kafka and the rest of the workers come in and clean up the site. As they start to cut down the Kaiju piece by piece, they send samples off to the defense force for testing. As they are slicing the bacon pieces down, Kafka yells at some good-for-nothing co-worker, who decides to move Kaiju bubble guts, causing it to explode and severely burn the worker's leg. Familiar with this, Kafka tells this man to apply for workers' comp. And so for his reward, Kafka gets reassigned poop duty, dreading the stench of nasty intestines. He gets through it, and he ends his day in his lonely, fancy apartment to watch his childhood friend Mina on TV, who is our mysterious baddie, get all the fame and glory as a young captain of the defense force. He then has a flashback of the childhood promise he made of killing all the Kaiju by joining the defense force. He then starts to pity himself, thinking about how he ended up in a situation, but tries to convince himself otherwise, saying his job is important. The next day, a young, plain, ugly-looking kid named Rino Ichikawa joins the disposal team and is introduced to Kafka. His boss tells Ichikawa that Kafka was a loser defense force dropout, which spikes Ichikawa's interest. Ichikawa then tells everyone he is not a quitter like Kafka is, even though he himself hasn't achieved anything. Unlike the future characters in this story, he is determined to be a part of the defense force. Little does he know he's about to be assigned poop duty alongside Kafka. As the day goes on, Kafka tries to help Ichikawa get through the day by giving him something he could stomach, since he needs the nutrients to help him work, and offers him some plugs for his nose to help with the stench. Ichikawa refuses it, so Kafka tries to wrestle him down for it. As they call it a day, Ichikawa thanks Kafka for helping him get through his first workday. He decides to tell Kafka that the defense force raised the age limit, giving our old geezer another chance to break his back to join the defense force. Kafka admits to Ichikawa he isn't a bad kid, and thanks him, when suddenly, a wild Yoju Diglett appears out of nowhere, ready to eat Ichikawa. Kafka jumps in to save him and tells Ichikawa to save himself, and to call in help while Kafka runs off, luring the Yoju away. It then goes into another flashback, showing their childhood city destroyed by a Kaiju, with Mina devoted about her destroyed home and the death of her cat. Does anyone ever wonder what happened to their parents? Anyways, the two youngins make a pact to make it into the defense force together. Now, back in the real world, thinking it's his time to shine, Kafka is determined to prove himself worthy of the Power Rangers, the defense force, and tries to fight off the Yoju. Since he is so weak, Kafka ends up folded like a lawn chair. Kafka is about to be devoured, and Ichikawa appears in time to slap sense into the Yoju. Kafka pities himself as usual by thinking nothing has changed and that he will never be able to protect anyone he cares about. The two face the Yoju. Kafka decides to have a yelling match with the monster, which is useless, like himself. Suddenly, the Kaiju is made into shreds by Mina and her giant white tiger. Points for whoever knows the tiger's name. Comment below. After, Kafka and Ichikawa are taken to the hospital due to their injuries. Kafka starts to loathe himself once again, saying Mina has left him in the dust. Ichikawa starts to simp and says that if it wasn't for Kafka, he would have died that day, and encourages Kafka to join the defense force because of how good-hearted Kafka is. While they're talking, a giant, disgusting mosquito-looking Kaiju confronts Kafka and says he's found him. Before Kafka can call for help, it flies into Kafka's mouth, disgustingly violating him, while Ichikawa is wondering what the heck the commotion is. By the time he pulls the curtain, he discovers a humanoid like Kaiju. It turns out that it's Kafka, who has taken on an insane transformation. Kafka tries to convince Ichikawa that it's really him. In turn, they both freak out, causing a huge commotion and frighten an elderly man who, in turn, decides to call the defense force. Ichikawa then urges they should escape before he is killed. Watch this next video and thank you, my fellow otakus.